Thanks, Ian. Thanks for this opportunity to speak to you all. Thanks for attending. Good morning, everyone. My name is Vittorio. I'm going to talk about human Earth system feedbacks and then how that can be implemented in modeling framework. I want to acknowledge my colleagues in this endeavor. Kay Calvin, who's done a tremendous amount of work, but is now on sabbatical from this, for lack of a better term. Tim Shippert, who is with PNNL. He's our main software engineer who's implemented a lot of the actual, making the human component an actual component within the E3SM system. And Ben Bond Lamberty, who's our new fearless leader. Saying new for now, but he has a distinguished history in this with the IAM-ESM development. It was prior to this. And so I'm going to spend some time today talking a little bit about background and why we're doing this. Some of you may be familiar that we are doing this, but you may not know why or what it means to the broader global modeling community. And I'll focus a little bit on the details of where we are with the E3SM GCAM coupling. So to start out with, this is in the context of scenario-based modeling, which is the basis for the CMIPS. And it has been for some time now, where you have a human system model, specifically the integrated assessment models or IAMs, create scenarios for 100 years or longer. And then those are passed to the Earth system models to run, to estimate climate. And then the outputs of that go to a group of folks doing sectoral impact analysis with another set of models. Now, this linear system actually may be missing something. That's why we're trying to understand what are the effects of feedbacks if we introduce them into the system, because these scenarios are not necessarily static in the real world. As the Earth system changes, the human system responds. And so you could have impacts on crop yields, which creates some land use adaptation. The changing temperatures change cooling and heating demand or energy shifts. You can have water availability changes that also change uses and development in the human system as it's progressing. And so in those 100 years, your scenario could be very different if you include these type of feedbacks. And so we really want to understand not only what happens through these feedbacks, but it's really important to know which feedbacks are important for the questions that we want to ask and the questions we want to answer, because there are many, many feedbacks. The system is highly interdependent between the human and their system. It's a co-evolutionary system, but we can't implement everything in a model. And so we're trying to not only understand the effects of feedbacks, but which feedbacks are most important and how to incorporate those. So in the previous incarnation of this work, called the Integrated Earth System Model, was a direct coupling of the Global Change Analysis Model and the Community Earth System Model. And this effort was a DOE effort that started over a decade ago now, and we have some results. We have a total of 6 papers actually from that effort. I'm going to show some results that we found with that are very interesting. And the first one is that when we introduce human feedbacks into the system, we do alter the scenario. That's the first step. And so the main feedbacks we introduced are shown in the upper left. This is a scalar of terrestrial productivity. So terrestrial productivity changes with the changing climate. We capture that, send it back to GCAM, which then redoes the scenario calculation every 5 years. These results are for RCB 4.5. And on the right, you can see the effects of those. These 3 graphs are the difference of with human feedbacks minus without human feedbacks. The upper right is the land use scenario, and there are dramatic changes there. The units here, this particular line is actually 1 million square kilometers of difference. The bottom right shows differences in crop prices in the human system. This bottom tick here is a minus 20% change in crop prices. You can see that in some of the runs after 2100. And this is the carbon stock. So this isn't necessarily part of the scenario, but it does influence the scenario in that GCAM values carbon in the landscape, and GCAM also calculates some land use change emissions, which can also change if your land carbon content is different. So further effects here on the Earth system. Again, we did some more work here with RCB 8.5 in addition to RCB 4.5. The scenarios are shown, at least the land allocation part of the scenario is shown on the left. They do change. This top panel, again, these are differences of with human feedbacks minus without human feedbacks. The top panel is changes in land carbon uptake. So it's the rate of carbon uptake And there are considerable differences in both scenarios. And in the bottom, this shows the significant changes in local temperature, surface temperature, when you include feedbacks. And in fact, there are hashing marks here showing where there are statistical significant differences in the surface temperature due to including feedbacks. Another thing that we looked at, how feedbacks affect the system, is in this land carbon feedback system. And many of you may be familiar with the CMIP4 experiments that look at how CO2 changes affect land carbon versus how temperature changes affect land carbon. And so we did some experiments like that with the IASM. The left here shows the change in terrestrial carbon storage on the y-axis and the crop rate change on the x-axis. Again, with human feedbacks minus without human feedbacks, with kind of these two pathways broken out. And so this red is the temperature change only, the blue dots are the CO2 change only, and then combined. And again, clear differences when we include feedbacks. And there's another way to look at it in this whole CMIP4 style type of experiment. There are feedback parameters. There's a carbon and a climate feedback parameter, a beta and a gamma. The x-axis is the CO2 feedback parameter. The y-axis is the temperature parameter. And you can see here in red, with human feedbacks, all these parameters over time are different, significantly different, clearly different than when you do not have human feedbacks. And so it affects this land carbon feedback process as well. So the upshot of this is that it does matter. Feedbacks do matter in the system, and we want to move forward understanding them better. And what I've done here in these next couple slides is listed a few papers. In fact, I think there's 7 listed here. And these are all pretty recent, except for this one paper is about 10 years old. It's probably the first example of an attempt to do global human Earth feedback modeling. These other ones shown here are all within the last 5 years. And then on top of this, we have the 6 IASM papers. This constitutes like the majority of the literature on this topic. And so I'm showing you this not because there's a lot of it, but because there's so little because it's so new. These papers are primarily discussion papers and framework type papers. What's the framework? What do we understand now that can help us move forward with human Earth feedback research? Or even like this one, call for a grand challenge. We need to look at physical and the socioeconomic process systems and see the antigens that impacts between them. So it's really a new and a very young area of research that is only gaining in momentum and interest because a lot of the focus now is, well, what are the potential consequences of our mitigation and adaptation strategies? And because those happen on a continuous basis in response to the changing Earth system, introducing feedbacks is really important to get a better grasp on the potential effects of those practices as opposed to having a static scenario and a static linear system. In addition to some of this literature that's trying to outline the path forward, there are a couple of professional organizations that have recently been developed, put together, instantiated. The one is the Open Modeling Foundation, and that's a consortium of folks that are interested in developing standards for modular model development. People can develop sectoral models of the Earth system or the human system, but then have kind of standardized APIs so it's easy to link those together in different ways to address the different types of interactions and feedbacks that they want to. And then another one is this AIMS working group, the Modeling Earth System and Human Interactions Working Group. And I'm involved in both of these organizations. I'm one of the founding members of the AIMS working group as well. For this working group, we had a workshop at the Hudson Global Change Institute last summer. We invited folks from a broad range of disciplines and fields, not just the global modeling communities. And that workshop was to then discuss what are our paths moving forward for modeling Earth-human interactions and feedbacks, and just a very brief set of highlights from that workshop as to these folks think we should do moving forward is right here. And the main points are that feedbacks are important, but not well understood. While some specific relationships we have a better grasp on, we really don't know much about feedbacks. There are several critical development needs on both human models and Earth system models are related to including biodiversity, better characterization of extreme events, human behavior is a big challenge, more explicit bioenergy work, and also things related to policy conditions and policy responses. And then since it's a very big resource-intensive project to do something like we're doing with E3SM and GCAM, there's a lot of discussion about what are different approaches we can take to better understand which feedbacks are important and so that we're not implementing them in full heavy systems if they're not important. And then there's a lot of discussion around the scenarios and how they need expansion. Climate's not the only factor. There are sustainable development goals now that are a big factor moving forward. And along with that, thoughts about scenarios being pathways rather than climate targets. So you can have different pathways that achieve the same climate target. And some questions around how do we incorporate shocks and disruptions into the system. And that's pretty up in the air at this point. And then this last point is that we really must reduce the inconsistencies across the human and Earth models, in particular inconsistencies in land use and land cover, how different practices are represented, and also baselines and definitions. A forest in one model isn't necessarily a forest in another model. And just an example of this last point, is an area of research that I work on a lot, of these inconsistencies. These are a couple figures showing differences between integrated assessment models and Earth system models. The panel on the left are bar charts showing the percentage of models with IAMs on the top, ESMs on the bottom, and each of the columns are different practice, forestry practice, agriculture, more biogeochemical, and then grazing. It's just showing the percentage of models that incorporate that practice. And the point here is that when you look from bottom to top, they're very different. Right? And that is a big challenge in scenario-based modeling because you want the Earth system model to be able to simulate what the integrated assessment model provides. And if the different integrated assessment models are providing different things and the different Earth system models are providing different things, you get a lot of differences just between models if you're doing a comparison that are just due to this mismatch in what they could simulate. And it's a little more detailed example. Integrated assessment models, the main things that they incorporate here, this is a chart of the integrated assessment models, are bioenergy, carbon capture, these two forest-related processes, technical increases in agricultural productivity, but they don't have biophysical effects, which is something that the ESMs do. You might say, well, Bex, we know ESMs don't have it. Technical advances in agriculture, ESMs don't really have it, but they surely have the forestry practices. But that still isn't necessarily the case. This is an older figure from CMIP 5. It's probably a bit improved now for CMIP 6, but it's not completely resolved. And this is showing on the green line here, the forest area in GCAM, which is a scenario, the forest area for an intermediate model that transfers the information from the global land use model and the land use harmonization data, and then the area that was in CLM. And this is over 8 million square kilometer difference by 2100. So these differences still exist today. And so what we want to do is improve this, right? We want to be able to implement and explore feedbacks, but we want to improve things like this that are already known. And our approach now is the E3SM GCAM coupling. And I want to point out that it is different than the integrated or system model coupling for a variety of reasons. One of the main differences is that the human component now is an actual component in E3SM. The information is passed through the coupler to the other components. While as in the integrated Earth system model, that took advantage of the existing file inputs for CO2 emissions, the land surface files that CSM was already using. The human component was called by the land model. At least I'm pretty sure it was. I didn't go back and check that. But essentially very hardwired in that it was called every 5 years and it rewrote these input files that the communicator system model can then read and use to have an updated scenario. So it worked and it worked well, but it was a very static system. So CSM and CLM all moved on in their advancement without these linkages. And so to take advantage of new developments and the rest of the model, we essentially have to rebuild this whole coupling every time, unless you put it into a system like E3SM where the human component is treated as another component like the rest, where any of these components can advance, the coupling infrastructure is still there and works, and you can plug in the new advancements right back into the system and it should run. And so this really facilitates the ongoing advancement of human interaction research, both in the sense of keeping up with the rest of the developments and these system models, but also it makes it a lot easier to add new feedbacks and test feedbacks because we can add some variables to the coupler passing with any of these other components. We just use the same infrastructure. Even if we want to add more to the land, like some water feedbacks or to the river, the infrastructure is there. We just need to make sure we pass those variables through and make sure our respective components know what to do with them. So now I'm going to go into a little more detail about the human component, which I sometimes call the IAC component, because that's what we called it for so long. This is what it looks like now, and actually what we have implemented and running. The land system is passing its information back and forth through the coupler successfully, but we still have to do the passing of the emissions through the coupler. And what we're, I guess, waiting on is maybe too strong of a word because we're not just sitting around, we're doing a lot of other stuff to prepare. But the model now, as we have it, is being rebased back to the E3SM master. And so this is actually a really good example of what I was talking about, how putting it into the structure makes it a lot easier to move forward. Because since we branched, the atmosphere model, EAM, has a different way that it deals with emissions in terms of how it ingests them. And so now we can just do a rebase, get the new atmosphere model, and then finish our coupling with the new structure that the atmosphere model wants, without having to redevelop the whole system. So this is really overwhelming. So I'm going to step through it. I think I have a few more minutes. I'll step through it piece by piece of how this human component works, because it's not just, it looks nice in one little box, but a lot of pieces of software involved in doing this. When you start, say in 2015, the human component is the first thing to run, and GCAM is the main core, the global change analysis model. That's what generates the land allocation. That's what generates the emissions that are then passed to the system model. But GCAM is on an unstructured grid. It is, the grid is defined by water basins intersected with geopolitical regions. And it runs either on a 1 year or 5 year time step. And so there's not only downscaling to grid level, there's also potential temporal interpolation that's needed. And so it feeds the land to one system, it feeds the emissions to a different downscaling system. And then we need to finish completing that. So I'm going to go through the land process. It first goes to a half-degree grid, and there are a couple of steps. There's an initial downscaling for some of the land type data, but not the harvest data. And then it's fed to the global land use model to finish downscaling the harvest data and to also generate data in the land use harmonization format. That's the format that CMIP6 uses. That's what we use when we generate land surface files for E3SM in general. And so that data is then fed through the land use translator and MakeSurf data, which some of you may be familiar with. This is the exact same code that's used for the standalone land surface files in E3SM. And then that's why this goes into that land use harmonization format. So we use the exact same code here to get the land surface files for ELM. Now, what we're writing here is a nominal 1 degree grid. We kind of fixed the human component grid to that because of all the remapping that happens on this left side. And so you can't change that, but your other models can still be at whatever grids have been implemented. We're testing with ELM and EAM on 2 degree grids. And so that was actually a good test to find out if the regridding is working properly through the coupler. And we learned some interesting things when we were doing this. And one is that the coupler is designed to map and regrid normalized state flux variables. I mean, I guess we knew that, but it means that when we're trying to pass fractions of vegetated land unit for PFTs, things don't get normalized correctly because that's a fraction of a vegetated land unit, which is a fraction of the land, which is a fraction of the grid cell. And so in order to successfully do this, we actually have to convert the PFT fractions to fraction of actual grid cell before we pass them across. And so then the coupler can do its mapping and regridding correctly. And then once we get it back to the land side, we have to calculate it back down to the fraction of vegetated land unit, which isn't straightforward because not a lot, those weights in that hierarchy can change at every time step, potentially because of dynamic land units. So it was interesting to figure out how to do the gymnastics here to make everything calculate out properly. ELM runs, generates MPP and net primary productivity and heterotropic respiration values that we then use for this terrestrial productivity feedback and also the soil carbon feedback. And we pass those back to the coupler. The coupler does some aggregation because ELM is doing this every 30 minutes. So some aggregation has to happen because the human component runs every year. And that aggregation basically takes monthly averages of those values from ELM and selects the annual maximum, which is then passed to another piece of software that generates the scalars that GCAM uses and also regrids that 1 degree grid to GCAM's unstructured grid and separates some of that out by the GCAM land types, which are different than the ELM PMTs. And that's done on this periodic basis that GCAM runs on, whether it's 1 year or whether it's 5 years. And that completes one cycle of this feedback. And it continues throughout the process so that you have your scenario keeps getting updated as you move forward. And then you get these different types of effects in the whole system, this evolutionary system, rather than giving it a static scenario. So that's the coupling in a nutshell. And I thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to answer any questions on any part of this.